Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The ETH Bitcoin valuation has been in a macro downtrend for a while, and we've been discussing it for a while. And the reasons that I have been bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation have just simply come down to really 2 to 3 things. Number one, last cycle, right? At least last cycle, we saw ETH Bitcoin bottom out after the first rate cut, right? If you look at the first rate cut, it happened to be in July of 2019. And we know that, well, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out just after that, a couple months after that. We also know, too, that last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed out right around the same time that the Fed shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. In fact, if you look at where the actual shift occurred, let me move this up a little bit so we can see this. If you go from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, you can see that it actually precisely marked the bottom on ETH Bitcoin in September of 2019. And this is one of the reasons why I did not think that it was bottoming out Q3 of 2023, because while it was during the same time in the cycle, we had not seen that shift in monetary policy. And so that is why I still remained bearish on ETH Bitcoin over here, because we had not yet seen that shift in monetary policy. Now, there has been a move up by ETH Bitcoin over the last couple of days, and so I did want to at least talk about that. At this point, everything that we have seen has been a lower high, right? Everything that we've seen by ETH Bitcoin, all of these are just simply lower highs that a lot of people got excited about, but then ultimately still resolved to the downside. And of course, at some point, theoretically, the trend will change, and instead of putting in lower highs, you'll start to see higher lows and higher highs. But because we haven't seen a shift in monetary policy, I don't think that phase has yet arrived. Now, if I'm wrong, I want to talk about what you would be looking for to sort of see if my view is starting to be incorrect. What I would say, and what I said in the last video I did on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, was essentially this. My view revolves around the idea that the bull market support band will guide ETH Bitcoin down, right? So if we pull up the bull market support band, one of the things you'll notice here, and let me actually get rid of these, the background on it. So one of the things you'll notice right here is that at the very end of it, right at the very end of it, actually I got rid of one of the lines I didn't want to get rid of, this one. At the very end of it, we had one final move back up where it was ultimately rejected by the bull market support band. Now, we've made the comparisons between the 2016 move and the one in 2019. And the one in 2016, after it broke down, it just continued to capitulate, right? It didn't really get any more bounces. It just went down. But here, after revisiting the range low, you will see that ETH Bitcoin got one final bounce back up to its bull market support band, but it was ultimately rejected by it. In fact, if you look at this, you will see some similarities. For instance, you can connect this low here to that low, and you'll see something very similar right there. Then after that, we put in a high and then a lower high right here above the bull market support band, and you can see that very similar pattern right there, right? So far, this move right here looks very similar to that one right there, does it not? Looks pretty similar. The move was essentially the same. You put in a low and then a lower low, and then you get above the bull market support band very briefly. You come back down below it. You get one, and then you did the same thing right here. You then get another pop back up, put in a lower high, and then go back into the bull market support band and come back down to the range low, right? So we did that, right? We did that again. We came back down to the range low. Now this time we actually went below the range low, whereas back over here, we did not before that bounce occurred. But regardless, in the last video that I did on ETH Bitcoin, I said that it is still possible that we get one final bounce before ETH Bitcoin reaches true and final capitulation this summer. Again, I could be wrong, right? I could be wrong. And just because I've been on the right side of ETH Bitcoin for a while doesn't mean that I will continue to be. So we first have to do away with that idea, right? I could, it could reverse before I'm willing to admit that it has. But I do remember this very similar move last cycle. And while I do believe that price dictates narrative, or narrative follows price rather than the other way around, one of the things that I said in the last video on the ETH Bitcoin valuation is that if you get a move back up to the bull market support band like you had over here, then the interpretation of it would probably be along the lines of something like this. The move up will be speculators dubiously speculating that the ETF will be approved, right? It's sort of this low probability outcome where some traders are betting that it actually might be approved, even though it's not, it doesn't really seem like it has a high probability. Again, I don't really know if it's going to be approved or not. I would assume that eventually it will be, but everything that I've seen in the news, and what you sort of people in the industry are saying, they're speculating that it's not going to be approved in May. So if it's not approved in May, then what potentially could be happening right now is you have speculators making a sort of a low probability bet that if it gets approved, then that could be the low, right? Just like there were some investors thinking, hey, maybe this is the low, right? But one of the things you'll notice about a lot of these ETH Bitcoin moves is that they really take place over like 1 to 2 weeks, right? This first move right here that we saw back in January, you can see that it topped out that week. Well, I guess and then it went a lower high the following week. The second top over here, which was a lower high, it had a pretty strong move up, but then it topped out on that third week. So they tend to not last very long. So if my view on ETH Bitcoin is going to continue to be correct, which again, there is no guarantee, then I would expect this to top out somewhere around 0.053 plus or minus, a few percent, right? Because that is ultimately where the bull market support band is. If you look last cycle at that final bounce before summer arrived, it occurred in mid-May, right? It occurred in mid-May, only a couple of weeks from now. It actually went above the bull market support band, right? And you could actually maybe even connect these wicks here. Not quite, but it almost made it back up to it. Maybe if we switch to a log scale, it's a little bit closer, but not even really. But you can kind of see that it was just a lower high. The first two bounces had weekly closes above its bull market support band, but they never saw follow through. The third one, while it had wicks above it, it did not stay above it for a weekly close. So right now, the bull market support band for ETH Bitcoin is 0.05346 to 0.0534. So it's basically right around 0.0534. 0.0534 is essentially where that is. And so if this pattern is going to repeat, then I would expect it to not durably go above 0.0534, right? So, you would probably see it stay mostly below the bull market support band with some occasional wicks above it if it's going to play out like it did over here before final capitulation. I will say, I'm not actually basing my view on ETH Bitcoin on this pattern, right? I'm not. And I know that might sound like a surprise, but I'm not basing it on that. I'm just basing it on monetary policy. That's basically what I've been basing it on. If you go back to the merge, when a lot of people were more optimistic about ETH Bitcoin and they were calling for the flippening, some of the reasons they were calling for it were due to the transition from proof of work to proof of stake. And you had, this deflationary mechanism. And so the speculation was that this change in demand, or sorry, the change in supply would cause the ETH Bitcoin valuation to go up because it's now deflationary, right? That was sort of the expectations back then at the merge. And so ever since then, though, we know that it's more than just a supply side thing, because if it were, then maybe you would have expected it to go up. It's also based on demand, which is affected by monetary policy. Again, my views on ETH Bitcoin for the last 2.5 years, my bearish views on ETH Bitcoin, have had nothing to do with the fundamental nature of ETH or what I think it might be capable of in the future. It has just to do with the fact that it's slightly riskier than Bitcoin. And during periods of tighter and tighter monetary policy and high interest rates, my expectation would be that a higher risk asset would lead to a lower risk asset. It has nothing to do with Ethereum in and of itself. And you can see the same pattern take place over multiple different asset classes. For instance, the Russell has been bleeding to the NASDAQ, right? Look at the Russell, been bleeding to the NASDAQ. If you look at companies like Rivian, been bleeding to Tesla, right? It's just that during these periods, these higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets, right? It's not that Tesla hasn't gone down, it has. It's just that Rivian has gone down more. So the views on ETH Bitcoin, it's not a reflection of my ultimate views on whether it'll be successful or not. I actually think Ethereum will be successful long term. It's more so a reflection of just this is what happens during tighter and tighter monetary policy, is that these higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets. And the reason that Ethereum is higher risk than Bitcoin is because it's more subject to regulatory pressures than Bitcoin is. Also, Bitcoin's been around longer, right? It's the first, it was the first one. It's been around longer. It stood the test of time longer than ETH. And so for that reason, it's riskier. Also, the market has spoken. The market cap of Bitcoin is higher than the market cap of ETH. And so yet again, yet another reason why I think Bitcoin is ultimately a safer play. So because of my views on monetary policy and the whole higher for longer mantra, I've been bearish on ETH Bitcoin for those reasons. Now, what ultimately usually causes the transition from tighter monetary policy to looser monetary policy is the breakdown of the blue chips, right? That's when the NASDAQ falls or Bitcoin falls, right? That's normally what causes the transition from higher or from tighter monetary policy to looser monetary policy. If you don't see that take place, then it likely means that inflation is still an issue and the consumer is still strong and we have to keep going higher for longer, right? But until you actually see that take place, then the Fed doesn't really have a compelling reason to pivot. Now, I do think the Fed will probably pivot sooner than the market thinks they will, because I think we're a lot closer to alt Bitcoin pairs breaking down than the market thinks it is. But this was an outcome that we suggested was a potential outcome in the last video. Now, I could be somewhat sympathetic because, anyone who's watching this video, if you're bullish on ETH Bitcoin and you watch my last video, I said, I think it's going to continue going down. You could have a temporary counter trend rally after the halving, right? Now, here's the thing. I think this is just a counter trend rally that will still resolve to the downside because of my views on monetary policy, not because of my views on ETH. However, if you have been bullish on ETH Bitcoin, you're going to look at this and say, well, this is the start of something else. And so at this point, we don't know. But again, my interpretation of this move, and I said it in the last video, was that the weakest time for Bitcoin and the time where ETH could make a move against Bitcoin will be just after the halving. After the hype wears down, just after the halving, you could see one final move by it before the final summer capitulation. Just like we did over here in 2019, about 2 months before the first rate cut arrived. ETH Bitcoin had one final bounce, and then it ultimately faded. Now, what I think is happening, as I said, is I think traders are speculating there's a low probability outcome that the ETF could be approved. I have no idea if it's going to be or not, right? Don't ask me, ask someone who's more in line or in touch with that side of the industry. I have no idea. But If that's the case, and it plays out kind of like these other local tops have played out, then what you would expect to see is it stall out around the bull market support band and then slowly start to bleed. And the reason why that would be the case is because you get the initial move up, right? The people over here get rewarded for buying into the fear, right? Into the halving. We get the bounce because people are speculating that the ETF might be approved, right? But as the end of May gets closer, and if there's not that overwhelming evidence that it's going to be approved, then you could start to see it slowly bleed back down, right? As the people who bought it here potentially take profits on it up here, especially if they're not seeing the signs that it's going to be approved. So again, at the end of the day, I do think that the narrative follows the price. But if you were to try to assign a narrative to this move, that's the narrative I would assign it, is that investors are speculating about ETF approval for ETH. And if it doesn't look like it's going to get approved, you could see it slowly bleed back down. And then once you have confirmation that it's being rejected, then you could actually see the breakdown. If it gets approved, then that could completely change the trend, right? If you were to overlay, right, if you were to overlay this fractal, honestly, guys, I've done this a long time, and the whole overlaying of fractals thing is not really my cup of tea, because I've seen it happen where people make these fractals, especially for like USD valuations of assets, where they say, well, this is what happened last cycle, therefore it's going to happen this cycle. And almost every single time it never plays out, right? And oftentimes it's because of diminishing returns, right? I think a lot of people sort of assume that every cycle we won't have diminishing returns, and then we keep having it. But they overlay the fractal from a prior cycle and say, well, look, this is what's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. But if you do overlay sort of this fractal here, and you just kind of compress it, it seems like this move over here has been taking place on a little bit of a shorter time frame. You can actually see like it lines up pretty well, right? I mean, you have a low, you get a lower low, you put in a high above the bull market support band, and then you put in a lower high, and then this is right when you get that final move back up to the bull market support band before it comes back down. Look at this, at the end of May. And the end of May, I believe, is when we'll have confirmation on whether that first deadline comes up, right? About the last couple of weeks of May. I don't remember exactly when. I think it was like May 20 something. I don't know exactly, but then you can kind of see like how that is. It's an almost identical pattern. Low, lower low, high, lower high. Between those highs, go below the bull market support band. Same exact thing. The highs are above it. You get another move back down below it, and then you get one final move back up before it capitulates into the summer, potentially bottoming out, according to this, in July. Now, in my last video on ETH Bitcoin, one of the things I said was that if it just breaks down in April and you get a similar move that you had in the last two breakdowns, what you would essentially expect is 3 red candles in a row that lead into the breakdown, right? That's what we had last couple of times, right? So over here, you had 3 reds in a row, and then the bottom came. Here, you had 3 reds in a row. The bottom occurred on the green candle, but 3 reds in a row, that ultimately marked that final capitulation. 3 months, grueling months in a row, where everyone just finally gave up. To me, this move right here looks really similar to this one, right? Where you run the lows, and then it ends up maybe even closing the month green, right? Kind of looks like that one. Now, here's the thing. Because this has happened, right? Because we've run the lows and we've come back up, that means that if it's going to play out like the last 2 cycles, then rather than bottoming out in June, which is what my base case would have been had we just seen this breakdown in April, because then we would have just been March, April, May, and then potentially bottoming out that following month in June, which is what happened last cycle. Because we've run it back up, look, guys, the degens, they've been fighting. And, I've seen for years how, the consumer will not go down without a fight. And my understanding of crypto, alt Bitcoin pairs, they represent the consumer, the strength of the consumer. The stronger the consumer, the stronger the alt Bitcoin pairs. The weaker the consumer, the weaker the alt Bitcoin pairs. We're all degens at heart, right? We're all degens at heart. So because this has happened, and we have seen that underlying weakness, short-term weakness by Bitcoin against ETH, so the short-term strength of ETH against Bitcoin following the halving, I think it delays it by a month, right? So then that means if you finally start this downtrend in May, as opposed to what was already happening, then it kind of kicks the can down the road. So if it were to follow this pattern, it would be, here it was June, July, and August, bottom in September. In this case, if we resume the downtrend next month, it would be May, June, July, with a potential bottom in either July or in August. It would be a bottom in July if it plays out like this move. Or sorry, it would be a bottom in August if it plays out like 2019. It would be a bottom in July if it plays out like 2016. Now, what's interesting is you also can see that in 2022, we had a lot of weakness by ETH Bitcoin in May and June. In fact, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, excluding stablecoins, one of the things you'll notice here is that it has seen a surge going into the summer months for the last 3 years. In fact, here it topped in June and then it had a slightly higher high in July. That was in 2021. In 2022, it hit the top of this wedge in June. In 2023, we did not hit the top of the wedge, but we did see it surge into the summer, right? It surged into the summer, into June. And also, by the way, dominance had a pullback here near the end of April, right? And then a surge into June. And then it came back down. And then once again, I'm speculating that perhaps we will see a final surge by dominance, excluding stables and also including stables, into the summer. And here's the thing. If we see that move, then, and we come up here, originally potentially going to be June, maybe it's going to be July now, I don't know. It could still happen in June. I'm not completely closed off to that idea. But that gets you, right, if it takes place in July, that gets you to about 64.5%, excluding stable coins, right? Excluding stables right now at 58%. So that's another 6.5% above the current level, right? Let's just say about 6% or so. Well, Bitcoin dominance is at 54%. 6% move gets you to 60%, which again is the 618 retracement on the Fib retracement tool, right? It's the 618, which is exactly where it retraced to last cycle before topping out just after rate cuts and just after and actually right during the time the Fed shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. I'll throw that back up here so that you can see it, right? You can see that's exactly where Bitcoin dominance topped out, was when the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So this is why I haven't changed my view, right? And like, I get it. I mean, I'm sure people are saying all sorts of stuff right now about my views, especially given this move. But guys, I've been really steadfast on my views on ETH Bitcoin the entire time. And every single one of these moves has been a lower high. It was never anything fundamentally against ETH that I had. It was just based on monetary policy. I think that after the Fed pivots, I think that ETH Bitcoin will bottom and then it'll start an uptrend. But because that hasn't happened yet, I don't think that this trend is necessarily over. One common counterpoint that I see, and it's a fair one. I'm not trying to dismiss it. I only bring it up if it is fair. If it's not fair, I'm probably not going to bring it up. One fair counterpoint that I see is that, well, ETH Bitcoin had this top at the merge, so what happens if it bottomed at the halving, right? That's a fair statement. It's possible, right? It's possible. But again, my view is based on monetary policy, not about these narratives. Furthermore, another counterpoint to it is that ETH Bitcoin did not top at the merge. It actually topped in 2021. So this was actually a lower high, right? So that we actually had a high over here, and then we had a lower high that occurred at the merge. So maybe this is your second to last low at the halving, and then the last low could be due to, or could be following rejection of spot ETF. I want to be clear, right? When I had this view on ETH Bitcoin back in, late 2021, early 2022, it's not like I thought that final capitulation would correspond to a potential rejection of the spot ETF, right? I had no idea. I think it just happens to be lining up, and I think that's what people might blame if it happens, right? If the spot ETF is rejected in May, and ETH Bitcoin capitulates, then I think that's what's going to be blamed. But we didn't even have that last cycle, and it still happened. It still happened. So I don't think that is necessarily going to, that like my view that I've had has never been contingent on anything related to the spot ETF, right? There's even a world where it gets approved and it still bleeds because maybe people price in a lot more demand for the Ethereum spot ETF than there actually is. Maybe people still prefer Bitcoin over Ethereum because we're still in tighter monetary policy. So I would argue that my view isn't even dependent on whether it's approved or not. I hope it is approved, honestly. I hope that the ETF is eventually approved. If it's approved in May, great. I would almost prefer that so we don't have to talk about it for the next year. But my point is that my view is not really dependent on that. My view is just dependent on monetary policy. And so far, that view has been correct, right? ETH Bitcoin did not bottom here. We took out that low. It did not bottom in October. It did not bottom in January. A lot of people saying it had bottomed then. Has it bottomed here? Maybe. I don't think so, though. I don't think so. I would say the odds of it bottoming here are a lot greater than back over here in January. And one of the reasons I said that was because everyone said, well, the next thing to look for is the ETH ETF, right? You guys remember that when we had this rally and everyone got excited because they're like, all right, well, now we're going to rally into the spot ETF for ETH, right? And I said, well, guys, we're forgetting one thing, right? The halving comes before that. So while I know people are getting excited about the ETH ETF, the halving is going to come first, and that's why ETH Bitcoin will likely go back down and put in a lower low, regardless of what happens with the spot ETF for ETH, because the halving is going to come in April. So we could have a scenario where, the people that they think that this is the low because it corresponds to the Bitcoin halving, just like we saw a high at the merge. But what if the final capitulation right here corresponds to bad news, like the rejection of the spot ETF, which might actually coincide with retail showing weakness and the Fed cutting rates? And just as that happens, as potentially final capitulation happens into the summer months, just like we've seen the last 3 summers, that is when it finally bottoms out, just after everyone gives up on it. I honestly think it would be somewhat poetic if ETH Bitcoin breaks down upon rejection of the spot ETF, and then everyone then puts on their maxi hat just as the Bitcoin dominance trend is ending. This Bitcoin dominance trend has been going on since May of 2021. Now, you might say, Ben, that's not true. Bitcoin dominance was putting in new lows in September of 2022. Again, including stables, you're right. Well, for this cycle, it wasn't a new low, but it was a new low for this cycle at the merge. But the dominance view is based on all Bitcoin pairs, not stable coins. If you exclude stables, dominance excluding stables bottomed in May of 2021, right? This trend has been going on for almost 3 years. This May will be 3 years of this Bitcoin dominance uptrend, assuming it hasn't topped, right? My argument is that it's going to continue to go up into the summer and finally top out just as social interest in the cryptoverse fades. And you can see, you can really see it happening already. And by the way, if you look at dominance excluding stables, we had this exact same move going into rate cuts last cycle. You'll see dominance excluding stables was putting in lower highs. You see that? A high, a lower high, a lower high. And then guess what happened? It swept the high. You see that? Right here? You see how we swept this high? And then after sweeping the high, dominance excluding stables came back down as ETH Bitcoin got that final bounce before summer. Dominance excluding stables swept the high and then came back down for one final move. And then dominance excluding stables then rallied into the summer. Now look at what happened today. Lower highs by dominance excluding stables. You sweep the high exactly right. Look at that sweep of the high. And then it's come back down. Look back over here. Look how much it dropped. It dropped from 61% down to 55.5%. That was a big drop back then. That was a big drop. Now, I don't think we're going to see the same magnitude of drop this time because this spread here was larger than the current one, right? This high here was like almost all the way up to 58% down to 50%, right? So about an 8% swing between those lows and the highs. If you look over here, it was from about 59% down to about 54, right? So only about a 5% swing. So it's compressed somewhat. So while this pullback was 61 to 55 and a half, right? So you had about a, that's a 4.5% move, 60, or no, 5.5% move, that's 61, not 60. So 5.5% move from 61 down to 55 and a half. Here, it's already dropped from 59 to 56 and a half, right? I mean, and that doesn't even include what's happened today. This is just based on the last data point. It's actually probably lower than this right now. This is just based on the last data point that we had, but dominance has gone down today. So, you know, I mean, if it goes from 59 even to 56, so what? Like, that's basically what it did last time. And then it still curled up. It curled back up going into the summer. And then it surged in June and July and August. Here, we might have to wait till June, but I think maybe it starts to surge in May, June, July. Could be June, July, August. But I think it's probably going to play out in a very similar fashion. In fact, if you connect these dots, it almost looks like we're just back testing the breakout point, right? We can go look at it, dominance excluding stables on TradingView. Look at this. If we just connect these dots, perhaps it'll, yeah, I mean, it's a bit hand wavy, right? I'm not connecting this one because it fits my narrative better not to, but I mean, you can kind of see that it's coming back in, and maybe it even goes below it, right? Maybe it comes back down to this trend line over here. Right? We've been holding that trend line forever. And also, by the way, if you look at excluding stables, we're still above the bull market support band. Right? So, sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. Right, we're still above the bull market support band. And you can even see there was another time previously where dominance excluding stables got below it. We then got a rally back above it, and then we kind of came back down and held it as support, just as we held the trend line as support. What if the same thing's happening, right? We went below it, we then got a pop back above, and now we're just sort of fading back into it. But I'm guessing that this bull market support band is going to continue to rise here and lift the dominance with it. The dominance excluding stables is at around 57 to 57.38%. That's only a 0.5% lower than where we currently are, right? That's where the 21-week EMA is, a 0.5% lower than where we currently are. If ETH Bitcoin gets a move to 0.053 to its bull market support band, there you have it, right? There you have dominance excluding stables back down to its bull market support band at the same time that ETH Bitcoin gets up to its bull market support band. So my guess is that you're going to see ETH Bitcoin top out here in the next week or so around the bull market support band, and you could see the turn happen either around the labor market data release next week, or it could be around the inflation data released later on in May. And again, I mean, it also could theoretically shift at the next Fed meeting, which is coming up really soon. So I would keep an eye on this because it seems like it's really playing out very similar to what happened over here. And I can't help but feel like, once again, everyone's potentially falling for that same playbook that they fell for in 2019, just before those rate cuts arrived. So that's my view on the market. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. I've been wrong about many things over the years. This is one thing that I've been on the right side of for the last couple of years for reasons I've stated based on monetary policy. Monetary policy hasn't shifted. Therefore, my bias on it still remains down. I ultimately think ETH Bitcoin is going to bottom out around 0.03 to 0.04. I don't know exactly where, but that's what I would ultimately expect. And I think if it gets down there, there's going to be a lot of people calling for it to go back to 0.01, 0.02, but I don't think it's going to go that low. I think 0.03 to 0.04, following rejection of the spot ETF, is likely the bottoming process for the ETH Bitcoin valuation. And I think that the current move by ETH Bitcoin is sort of the last hurrah, just like it got in 2019 before rate cuts arrived, before it ultimately capitulated down into the summer. So that is my view. It has nothing to do with spot ETF. I tried to provide some narrative around it if you want a narrative to go with the chart, but I don't really think you need one. It looks the same thing like it did last cycle. I said it's possible we get one final rally back up to the bull mark support band at around 0.053 to 0.054 before capitulation into the summer. It seems like that's what's happening. Just because it's happening doesn't mean I'm right. It could be that it is a low. But in order for confirmation of that, you would need to see you would need to see ETH Bitcoin get above its bull mark support band and then start holding it as support, right? And if you don't see that, then I still think it's just going to be yet another lower high that everyone once again got excited about that ultimately resolved to the downside. The last thing I will say is that last cycle, the ETH Bitcoin capitulation occurred. It finalized after alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. So one thing about this bounce is that alt Bitcoin pairs had not yet broken down, right? They haven't had a weekly close below their range low. So I think that you're seeing something very similar with alt Bitcoin pairs that you saw over here. One final rally up to the bull mark support band. It didn't even make it to the bull mark support band back then. And then it came down, right? I think you're seeing something like that happen once again with alt Bitcoin pairs. One final push before capitulation down to the range lows this summer. And because this is happening, because of this bounce by ETH Bitcoin, now maybe you do see alt Bitcoin pairs durably break down before ETH Bitcoin. That's what happened last cycle anyways. Alt Bitcoin pairs durably broke down the week of June 24th. ETH Bitcoin broke down the week of July, what was it, July 7th? July 8th, right? So the ETH Bitcoin broke down 2 weeks after alt Bitcoin pairs did. So with this move by ETH Bitcoin, perhaps that's something. One thing I was looking at is while ETH Bitcoin did get a close below the range low from June 2022, a weekly close below it, what's kind of interesting is that it did not get a weekly close below this recent low, right? This recent low was at 0.079, and then the weekly close was at 0.048. So perhaps that is something to sort of take note of. Again, my expectation is that it will still break down. Alt Bitcoin pairs might actually break down first, just like they did last cycle, in a durable fashion, right? I mean, to some degree, ETH Bitcoin already did break down because it got a weekly close below 0.049, but I think this is the final push before the final capitulation into the summer. As we get into potential rate cuts, I don't know, probably not in May, right? I don't think we're going to get a rate cut in May, but I could see a rate cut coming sometime this summer. Probably not a huge one unless something catastrophic happens, right? But it could be just sort of like a 25 basis point rate cut, could be a 50 basis point rate cut. In fact, in 2019, we got a rate cut in July. You know, maybe there's just some underlying weakness that occurs, you know, in the summer. And I've talked about that before with alt Bitcoin pairs, is that you can see that we got a rate cut in July in 2019. That was when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. And the reason I think this happens is it goes back to the social risk. I think that people lose interest in crypto in the summer months a lot of times. And when people tune out, that's when the bid for altcoins against Bitcoin kind of dries up. And then that's when Bitcoin dominance surges, as you saw Bitcoin dominance surge in 2021 and 2022 and in 2023 in the summer months. And you can see the social risk is kind of still looking 2019-esque, right? It's now putting in lower lows from this low right here and lower highs, which is exactly what happened over here in 2019, just before rate cuts arrived. So I think the reason why you can get that capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs in the summer is because retail is once again tuning out. You know, I know there were some people that were kind of hopeful that maybe they would tune back in, but if you look at YouTube views, for a lot of these crypto YouTube channels, there was a spike going into the halving, but I mean, look at this. It's just been bleeding ever since then, right? It's just been coming all the way back down. So I think that's kind of the reason that you could see final capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs this summer, is because in the summer months is oftentimes when people stop caring about the markets for a while. And if the bid for altcoins disappears relative to Bitcoin, that's when alt Bitcoin pairs capitulate. And you've already seen some alt Bitcoin pairs already capitulate. You know, Matic Bitcoin has already, you know, it's already been in the process of capitulating well below its range lows. Same thing with ADA Bitcoin and Dot Bitcoin. They're well below their range lows, and so on and so forth, right? The list goes on and on. But again, those are my views. I don't know if I'll continue to be right about the trend, but those are at least the reasons why I remain optimistic on Bitcoin dominance, and I remain bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. Monetary policy has not shifted. Once it does, I will then be looking for a low on ETH Bitcoin, but I don't think that's going to happen until this summer. If you guys like the content, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. That'll wrap it up for this time. See you guys next time. Bye.